Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Shoulders Down. If you are listening, I want to remind you that these episodes are now being posted on YouTube with video. So if you're more of the kind of person that likes to watch something instead of just listening to audio, then head to the link in the show notes or just type in Leah Kerr Nutrition to YouTube and you can subscribe. I personally have gotten really into YouTube lately, which is part of why I wanted to start putting these episodes in video form on YouTube. I work from home and I spend a lot of time by myself in the house, and I love putting on a YouTube video while I'm like cleaning or eating lunch or something to kind of feel like I'm there hanging out with someone else because sometimes working from home can get lonely and video just adds like another element of that. So definitely check out our YouTube channel. It's been a fun new endeavor. So I am recording this on Saturday, November 30th, which is 2 days after Thanksgiving. I hope you had a nice Thanksgiving if you celebrate. And I thought today we would talk about what to do after you binge or overeat or eat past comfortable fullness, whatever term you resonate with, because Thanksgiving can really be a holiday where that ends up happening, but also the holiday season in general, whether you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or even just like having a big food celebration that comes with New Year's or something like that, it can result in overeating or eating past comfortable fullness or binge eating. So I wanted to make this episode for you in case you end up eating past comfortable fullness and you're like, oh, I just feel so gross. I want this feeling to go away. What do I do? This is going to be the episode that you reference when that happens. Today, we're answering the question, what to do after a binge. And a little note on terminology. I know some folks don't resonate with the term binge because it can feel so clinical and official. So if you don't resonate with the term binge, a lot of my clients resonate more with this idea of eating past comfortable fullness or even eating to the point of feeling sick, or some people say overeating. I don't love saying overeating because I think it's kind of stigmatizing because it's like it suggests that there's a right amount to eat and you've gone past that. And there's no morality, there's no right or wrong. But eating past comfortable fullness is such an objective way to describe the experience of whether you call it a binge, whether you call it overeating, whatever it is. Objectively, if you've gotten to a point where your body feels uncomfortable, you've gone past the point of comfortable fullness, that's what we're talking about in this episode. So call it whatever. I'll probably refer to it as a binge just for making it easy, and it's the simplest one word way of describing this. But know that if you don't have diagnosed binge eating, which a lot of people never get that diagnosis, or if the term binging feels too clinical and you wonder if you officially meet that criteria, don't get too hung up in the weeds here. If you're experiencing episodes of eating past comfortable fullness, this episode is for you. In today's episode, I am first going to share a little bit about my personal story. Then we'll go through what not to do and what to do instead. And then there'll be a section at the end for some sort of like catch-all tips and tools that I want to leave you with. But before we dive into my personal story, I want to start by recognizing that binge eating sucks. It's so uncomfortable. It can leave you feeling so isolated of like, why does this happen to me? Why do other people seem to have food stuff under control? And to add to it, it can lead to feeling so physically uncomfortable and just yucky and gross. And of course, there's often layers of shame that comes with it. And it is just so not fun. And I so understand the feelings of regret and discomfort that are part of binge eating. So going into this episode, I want you to know that you're not alone if you're experiencing this. Probably most of the folks listening to this have experienced episodes of eating past comfortable fullness that brought them to the intuitive eating anti-diet space. So you're absolutely not alone, and know that you really don't have to be experiencing this forever. We're going to talk about some tips and tools to get you out of this cycle of binging and restricting. I thought I'd start with a few words on my personal story. So, if you've listened to this podcast or followed me on any platform, you know that I got involved with this intuitive eating work and became an intuitive eating dietitian in part because of my own story. I will link to my story episode, the one where I go through the whole thing, the whole saga. I will put that in the description or the show notes, and you can listen there if you want to get the whole thing. But pretty much binge eating was a big part of my story. And I remember so many times feeling so gross and regretful and helpless after a binge. Thankfully, purging was never part of my story, at least purging through vomiting, but I did participate in some compensatory behavior such as overexercising and restriction. And so I would just feel like I don't know what to do and I want this feeling to go away. And so I took to Google feverishly looking for answers about what to do, how to find relief after a binge. And I read things about, guzzling green tea and making plans to start another diet and doing all of this crazy exercise to reverse the binge and all of these things. And spoiler alert, those things only perpetuated the cycle of binging and then being quote unquote good and then falling off the wagon and saying screw it and binging again. And it just continued. And I felt crazy. Like, why can't I get out of this cycle? And part of that has to do with if after a binge, if you're resorting to diet culture behaviors, you're just going to stay in that cycle. And looking back, I see that now that like forcing myself to like do exercise and drink a ton of green tea and do all these like weird behaviors wasn't actually going to lead to sustainable healing. And in this episode, I'll share the things that all these years later, in my professional experience as an intuitive eating dietitian, the things that I know will lead to sustainable healing. We're going to go through 4 things not to do, and then I'll share after each thing what I recommend doing instead. So, the first thing not to do after a binge, this one might sound obvious, do not purge for obvious reasons. Now, purging actually can look more ways than one. So I kind of alluded to this when I was speaking to my own story. I think most people, when they hear the word purge, think about inducing vomiting to throw up the food that you just ate. But there are actually other forms of purging. Purging can also look like compensatory exercise to try to like purge through movement. But for the sake of this bullet point, we'll talk about purging in the sense of vomiting. I know it's so much easier said than done if you're struggling with purging as part of your story right now. For me to be like, don't purge, that is so much easier said than done. I recognize that. I recommend reaching out to a professional, like a registered dietitian or a therapist, to get support if purging is a behavior that you are struggling to stop engaging with, because it can be extremely damaging on so many levels. It can damage your digestive tract because when that acidic stomach content comes up your esophagus and into your mouth, that can damage your teeth, your enamel, the lining of your esophagus, and other parts of your digestive tract, and that can be extremely damaging. Also, it damages your relationship with your body and your body's cues because it's the opposite of what your body wants. Your body wants to absorb nutrients. It doesn't want to be expelled of nutrients, and that can be really confusing for the body and lead to a lot of attunement disruption because your body's like, what's going on here? Why is this coming up instead of staying down? And there's so much more to say, obviously, on purging behaviors. I tend to work with folks who more so struggle with disordered eating as opposed to very clinical eating disorders. I typically don't work with folks who are actively engaging with frequent purging. That tends to be more of an acute situation where they might need a higher level of care. So I'm not going to go in too much depth on this one. But I feel like how could we talk about an episode about binging and what to do after a binge without mentioning that purging is absolutely not what we want to do after a binge. So what you can do instead of purging is to work on sitting with the discomfort of the feelings in your body. And I know this can be, again, so much easier said than done. So many folks really struggle to sit with negative emotions or negative sensations in their body. And depending on where you're at in your journey, this might not even be accessible for you right now, but it can be really supportive to work on allowing yourself to get familiar with the sensation. What does it feel like after a binge? You can do a body scan. What does it feel like starting in your head, your throat, your chest, your stomach, all the way down your body? Maybe you notice some thirst, some dehydration in your mouth. Maybe you notice some acid reflux in your throat. Maybe you notice some heartburn in your chest. Maybe you notice some gurgling or funky noises in your stomach. What are you experiencing in your body? Can we get curious about those sensations, and can we work on building our capacity for sitting with those emotions instead of immediately having to turn to get this stuff out, purge, get rid of it? If we can work on sitting with these negative emotions, it will really help in the long term, because it will help us prove to our bodies that we have the capacity to feel negative emotions. It's okay. It's not going to be life or death. We're capable of sitting with those kinds of emotions. We have resilience, and it will also be beneficial because when we get curious about the sensations that we're experiencing in our body, we can store that memory of what it feels like after a binge. And then we can sort of file it away in our internal filing cabinets in our brain. And then in the future, when we're faced with a situation where a binge might happen, we can think about, all right, how do I want to feel in my body right now? How do I want to feel after this eating experience? How did I feel after the last eating experience where I binged or ate way past comfortable fullness? You can sort of pull that file, pull that body scan of how it felt head to toe, how it felt emotionally, physically, and then you get to sit with it and say, do I want to feel this way? Whereas if we don't work on sitting with our experience in our body and sitting with the negative emotions that can come up as a result of a binge, and we just kind of sweep it under the rug, then in the future, when we're in an eating experience and we're sort of at that crossroads of whether or not it's going to turn into a binge, we don't have a file to pull to say, this is how it felt last time, because the shame causes us to not want to sit with those emotions and that physical experience and store that file. And it just causes us to rip the file up and throw it in the fire to burn, because we don't want to remember it. We want to wipe our hands clean of the perceived crime, and then we don't have information to reference in the future. So I know it's so much easier said than done, and it absolutely might require support from a registered dietitian like myself, or a therapist, or a whole team, depending on how acute your current situation is with purging. But the first piece here of what to do after a binge is do not purge. Instead, work on sitting with the discomfort that you're experiencing in your body. The next thing not to do after a binge, do not beat yourself up. Instead, we want to practice using self-compassion and gentle inquiry. The reason that we don't want to beat ourselves up is because when we beat ourselves up and say, oh my God, Leah, what are you doing? You're such an animal. You're so gross. You have no self-control. You have no discipline. When we start to bully ourselves, this leads to a stress response in the body. Our body goes, oh my God, we're under attack. Something's wrong. And you are under attack. It's just that the attacker is you. You are attacking yourself. And because of our evolutionary wiring, because of the way our reptilian brain has been wired since the beginning of human time, we have a certain response to stress. It activates our sympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that is nicknamed fight or flight. And certain things happen as a cascade effect when sympathetic nervous system is activated. So when you shame yourself, right, what happens next? Sympathetic nervous system is activated. When sympathetic nervous system gets activated, we get a spike in cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and blood gets shuttled to our heart and our extremities, our arms and legs, because our body is preparing to fight or flight from the perceived predator. Even though there is no actual threat in the environment, there's no animal that we're running from, we are just perceiving ourselves as a threat because we are bullying ourselves. And that's causing a stress response in the body. And our body doesn't know the difference between there's a lion in front of us and we're being bullied by ourselves because of what we just ate. So when blood gets shuttled to the heart and to the extremities, the arms and legs, what happens is, in turn, the blood is moving away from the digestive tract. And when blood moves away from the digestive tract, it inhibits digestion and slows metabolism. So when you've just eaten a lot of food that doesn't feel comfortable, we don't want digestion to be inhibited and metabolism to be slowed. This is a time when we really want optimal digestion and metabolism so that we can move through the discomfort and make it through to the other side where we are no longer feeling yucky from overeating. And the more optimally that digestion and metabolism is working, the quicker we'll get through that. And stress inhibits that process. Again, this is because part of what's happening with stress, with the cortisol response, with the fight or flight response, is blood flow is going to our heart and to our extremities to prepare to fight or flight from the perceived predator. And in turn, when blood's going to the heart and extremities, our brains are saying, hey, digestion is not top priority right now. Top priority is fighting or flighting from this fighting or fleeing from this perceived predator. We got to put digestion on the back burner and we got to send blood to the heart. We got to send blood to the arms and legs so we can handle this predator. Now, as a result, again, digestion and metabolism are inhibited, which is certainly not helpful, especially when we've just consumed a large amount of food that we really do need to digest and metabolize. And another reason not to beat yourself up and to use self-compassion instead is because of, like we mentioned earlier, when we beat ourselves up, that shame makes us not want to remember the experience. It makes us want to shove that experience under the rug, wipe our hands clean, and move on. And when we don't remember the experience, then we're bound to have repeated episodes in the future because we never allowed ourselves to experience what the sensations were. We never allowed ourselves to sit with the discomfort. And then again, when we go in the future, when we're at a crossroads where a binge might happen or it might not, and we want to look in our filing cabinet in our brain to say, how did I feel last time this happened? Is this the experience I'm going for? Is this how I want to feel today? Though there will be no file to pull with information about how it felt after that binge, how you felt physically, emotionally, if you shame yourself, because shame leads us to want to forget the experience as quickly as possible and wipe our hands clean of that perceived crime. Whereas self-compassion, which looks like sitting with yourself and saying, oh, yeah, that wasn't fun. So when talking about self-compassion, I like to use Kristen Neff's framework for the three pillars of self-compassion. Kristen Neff is a self-compassion expert. I have talked a little bit more about her work on other episodes. I will link to one with Lindsay Everhart, I believe. It was her interview. She's a therapist, and we talked about the use of self-compassion when healing from disordered eating. So I will link to that in the description slash show notes. So Kristen Neff uses three pillars of self-compassion because I know self-compassion can sound like, okay, like what is this? It's this like kind of intangible sounding thing. So I love Kristen Neff's framework because she makes it tangible. So her three pillars are self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Self-kindness looks like being kind to yourself, treating yourself the way you would treat a friend. If a friend called you and said, ugh, Leah, I just binged. Would you say to your friend, like, ew, you're such a piece of shit. What's wrong with you? You have no discipline. You have no self-control. No. I mean, if you would say that to a friend, you got to check yourself because that's not the kind of friend I think most people want to be, and it's not definitely not the kind of friend most people want to have. More likely, you would say to a friend, "Ugh, buddy, it happens. It sucks. I hear you. It's not fun, but it happens." This is the kind of self-compassion, self-kindness, and understanding that we're talking about in this first pillar of Kristen Neff's three pillars of self-compassion. The second pillar is common humanity. Common humanity looks like reminding yourself that you're not alone. So in this case, it could sound like, yeah, binging sucks and binging happens. A lot of people experience this and it's not my fault. I am in good company. A lot of people are dealing with this and trying to find their way through this experience. I am not alone. The reminder that we're not alone can really help us soften into self-compassion versus isolation, and judgment. And Kristen Neff's third pillar of self-compassion is mindfulness. So mindfulness looks like, how are you feeling? What is coming up for you? What's happening emotionally? What's happening physically, which we've already sort of been talking about, this neutral, objective observing of your physical and emotional experience versus that attaching judgment to your experience. When we practice self-compassion after a binge, instead of berating ourselves, what happens on a physiological level, instead of activating our sympathetic nervous system, which is that one that gets activated when we're stressed, that fight or flight system, we instead activate our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite of sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous system is nicknamed the rest and digest system. So that's what we want. We want to be able to digest and optimally metabolize. So when we are activating our parasympathetic nervous system, our body is in its optimal state for digestion, and blood flow is optimal. Our body is nice and calm. We're not causing extra blood to be shuttled to the heart and extremities because we're not expecting a predator in our environment. And this leads to better digestion and metabolizing, which again is completely crucial when you've just binged or eaten a large amount of food that needs to be digested and metabolized. The next thing that we don't want to do after a binge is we don't want to plot another diet. We don't want to say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to start Weight Watchers, or macro counting, or being good, or eating clean, or whatever it is. Instead, we want to work on listening to our body's cues and practicing intuitive eating. The reason why we don't want to plot another diet after a binge is because this will only keep us stuck in that binge restrict cycle, and you'll end up right back in this position of feeling gross the next time you inevitably fall off the wagon, which, by the way, isn't your fault. It's part of the nature of diets. Restriction is not sustainable, and it will lead to eventually saying screw it and eating whatever you want or binging. So we absolutely do not want to plot another diet. Instead, we want to work on honoring our body's cues, listening to our body's hunger, fullness cues, prioritizing satisfaction, and practicing the other pillars of intuitive eating. Now, if you're newer to intuitive eating, I will link below in the show notes slash description a podcast episode that I did called 10 Pillars of Intuitive Eating in 10 Minutes. So you can get a nice overview of what makes up the pillars of intuitive eating. But in general, we want to focus on listening to our body's cues instead of outsourcing our eating decisions to another meal plan or diet or food protocol, because this will only perpetuate our disconnection from our body, which will lead to continued binging and restricting. The next thing that we don't want to do when we have just had a binge, we do not want to deprive ourselves of food to compensate for the binge. Instead, we want to continuously honor our hunger cues when hunger strikes again after the binge, which it will. You will eventually get hungry in time. You will not stay super full and feeling really gross forever. Your body is really smart. It will eventually digest and metabolize that food and clear it from your system, and you will get hungry again because you're a human that requires consistent food. And if we deprive ourselves when we get hungry again and say, no, you're not allowed to eat, you just ate so much, you're not allowed to eat, this is again perpetuating this restrictive diet mentality, which can lead us to feeling scarcity of like, oh my God, food isn't available when we're hungry. And that can lead our body to have this compensatory behavior, this urge to sort of hoard food or overindulge on food, aka binge, when the chance becomes available, because our bodies are like, oh my God, we can't trust that food will always be available when we're hungry. We need to gorge ourselves in case there's another period of restriction around the corner. So we want to focus on when we get hungry again, honor that hunger. I know it might feel like, oh my God, how could I be hungry? I just binged, but your body requires consistent fuel. It's like saying, oh my God, how can I need gas? I just filled up my car. Yeah, if you drive that thing around, you're gonna need gas. And the same thing with being a human. If you just had a bunch of food and your tank was on full, but then some hours went by, yeah, you're going to inevitably need food because you're a human and your body needs food to run. So that is the end of the segment of don't do this instead. Now we're going to move into just some overall tips that don't really fit into that format, but things that are going to be helpful to think about after a binge. I want to give a caveat here of like, these tips are helpful, but I don't want you to take these tips and try to like take it to the extreme, which can be the inclination for so many of us coming from diet culture. So, when I recommend things like, drinking water, it doesn't mean like more is better. It doesn't mean like chug gallons and gallons and gallons. No. When I recommend some movement, it doesn't mean like go walk or run for hours and hours. That's not what this is about. That is taking things to diet mentality and taking things to this like all or nothing extreme, which won't be sustainable and won't be helpful. With that, my first tip for after a binge is to validate your discomfort. It absolutely sucks to feel gross after a binge. That feeling of just like, ew, I feel so like heavy and yucky and gurgly, and like maybe it's giving you weird poops, and maybe you feel, I don't know, maybe you feel like your stomach is gonna pop, like you just feel gross. That sucks, and you're allowed to be upset about it. So, my first tip for you is to give yourself space to be upset. And that might look like journaling or just kind of letting yourself mope or venting to a trusted loved one. Let yourself be upset. When we allow ourselves to do this, it helps us build the capacity to feel hard emotions. And it also prevents this toxic positivity of like, it's okay. Your body is smart. Your body is kind. All these things. It's like, yeah, all of those things are true. And I do recommend saying those nice things to your body. But without first validating the discomfort that you're feeling, it can feel kind of like, yeah, invalidating of like your body's like, hello, we're feeling these negative things. We don't just want positive affirmations. We also want validation that, yeah, these things are shitty and it is valid that we're feeling this way. The next tip is you can, after a binge, you can engage in some gentle movement. Now, this can look like anything from going on a gentle walk to stretching to, I don't know, maybe just moving your body in place. Maybe you're sitting down, kind of rolling your neck, bringing your arms up and down, just very gentle movement. And the reason that this can be supportive is because gentle movement helps with blood flow. When we move our bodies, it helps to move blood around. And when we get the blood moving around, it helps us to get optimal blood perfusion to our digestive tract, which again helps with metabolism and helps everything move through. And when things move through, we can get that feeling to pass maybe a little bit faster. Now, I'm not talking about like, the more you move, the quicker this happens. No, it's not like that, but this is just one thing that can help get the blood moving. And when blood flows, it kind of kicks the whole system into action, which can help with digestion, metabolism, and even bowel movements. On that same note, another tip is if you like tea or warm beverages, even just like hot water with lemon, this can be something else that can help with blood flow. Warm beverages help our blood vessels to expand and open up and dilate. And when our blood vessels dilate, it helps with blood flow. So warm beverages can help bring more optimal blood flow to the digestive tract, which again can be supportive for metabolism and digestion. Another tip along the same idea here is hydration. So drinking some water when we're adequately hydrated, it also helps with blood flow. It helps our blood become less viscous and more sort of swishy to help things move through with more ease. And on top of that, sometimes if you've binged on something that is very sweet or salty, that can make our blood more concentrated and it can cause us to need more water to dilute the concentrated aspects of the blood. So sort of a double whammy with hydrating, but also if you're listening to your body, you probably will notice increased thirst after a binge. So something to stay curious about. The next tip for what to do after a binge is to shower or put on comfy clothes or do something to take care of your body and to keep yourself comfortable while you wait for the feeling to pass. If possible, we don't want to be in like tight constricting jeans or, wearing something that's really tight to our stomach and making us feel extra aware of our stomach because it's hard enough to feel yucky after a binge, and those things like constricting clothing can just bring even more awareness. Now, doing something like taking a shower or I don't know, lighting a candle or doing something that's a form of self-care is a way to show your body like, "Hey, I know we didn't take the best care of you right now because of this binge, but we're gonna do what we can to kind of make it up to you and show you that we really do care about you." And by we, I mean like you and your body. That's how I think of things. And it can be a way to sort of give yourself a peace offering of like, "Hey, we're gonna try to do something to honor you and make you comfortable while we wait for this yucky feeling to pass." The next tip is to observe curiously what happens after a binge. So we talked about this a little bit earlier with a body scan, but I want you to observe what happens the rest of the day and even into the next day because when we eat a big amount, well, when we eat food in general, it can impact our cravings and the amount of food that we desire even into the next day or even into the next 2 days sometimes. So what I mean by this is notice like how long does it take you to get hungry again? What kinds of things are you hungry for when you get hungry again? This just can be an interesting way to observe how your body responds to binging. And when I work with clients, this can actually be like a really hopeful way to start to see that the trust is being rebuilt with the body. So, an example of a client story I'll share here is I had a client who went out to dinner and ate an amount that was past comfortable fullness. And she noticed that the next morning, she didn't get hungry as early as she usually does for breakfast. She got hungry a bit later. And when she did get hungry, she didn't crave her usual bigger breakfast. And she was desiring something that was a little bit more like lighter and refreshing. And that doesn't make her better, like morally superior. It is just objective information of like, look how smart your body is. Your body has the capacity to balance these things out and to store and utilize nutrients over time. So your body's like, oh, okay, we had a lot of food then. Maybe we don't need as much the next day to kind of even things out because you've gotten more energy and fuel in your stores from the binge. And this can be a really nice way to start to see, oh, my body does know what it's doing. It does know how to, it's got this under control. It knows how to modulate things to kind of balance and even things out when things like binges happen. The next tip that you can use after a binge is to think long term. After a binge, it's normal to want to just think about the immediate moment of how do I reverse this feeling of feeling yucky? What do I do? How can I fix this right now? But if we engage in destructive short term behaviors like purging or restricting or dieting, it's only gonna hurt us in the long run. So I want you to focus on thinking about the big picture, the long game, healing your relationship with food, becoming an intuitive eater, breaking this cycle of binging and restricting. I find that this can be a strong motivator to help you through the discomfort of post binge. If you have sort of this North Star that you're heading towards of like, I need to stay strong so that I don't continue in this cycle of binging and restricting. Okay, second to last tip. Binges can feel defeating, but I want you to remember that it doesn't mean that you're failing. After a binge, consider asking, what can I learn from this binge? What happened? Was it something going on emotionally? Was it that you didn't eat enough throughout the day and you entered into the eating experience with extreme hunger? When we enter into eating experiences with extreme hunger, that pendulum is pulled, pulled, pulled far in the direction of hunger, and it's our body's natural compensatory response to smack in the other direction. This is why we don't want to ignore our hunger cues after a binge because then we're just going to keep riding this violent pendulum swing. This is why we want to honor our hunger cues when they strike after a binge and always. But think about, why did this happen? And maybe you'll come up with some ideas if you look back on your day, if you look back on your emotional state. Sometimes it can be hard to examine this by yourself. This is a lot of what I help clients do, is to really get that neutral third party perspective of like what was going on here. I have them talk me through their day, and listen closely and take notes to help them kind of do the detective work of figuring out what happened here. What was the need that wasn't being met? Was it because you weren't satisfied with the food you were eating throughout the day? Was it because you didn't eat enough throughout the day? And we really get in there and do this detective work. So maybe journal about it, maybe talk to your therapist or dietitian about it. And if you don't have a therapist or dietitian, maybe consider getting that support if you're not able to figure out your patterns by yourself. And really think about, there is no failure, there's only feedback. So binging isn't a failure, it's an opportunity to learn what was wrong, what was going wrong there. What can we do in the future to prevent a similar experience from happening? You can also think about, what is the magnitude and the frequency of your binges. So from when folks are first starting intuitive eating work and, in diet culture, often the magnitude and the frequency of the binges is intense. When they happen, they're of a great magnitude and they're happening very often. Realistic healing from a binge eating journey doesn't look like, poof, one day, no more binges. What realistic healing on a binge eating journey looks like is that the magnitude and the frequency of the binges starts to go down. So if you picture this like a graph where you have, magnitude on one axis and frequency on the other, and you think of it almost like, at first it's like a very tightly coiled phone cord. And then as you do this work, it's like you're pulling the phone cord and the peaks are becoming less high, less tightly coiled, and they're also spreading out more. The peaks are becoming more spread out, which means the episodes of binging are more spread out, they're less frequent, and the magnitude, the peaks of the binges are less high. This is what I want you to look at. So even if you binge and you feel feeling gross and uncomfortable and defeated, look at, what was the magnitude of this binge compared to other binges? What's the frequency looking like? When was the last time I binged? This can be a way to zoom out and see your overall progress on healing from binge eating without slipping into this all or nothing mentality of like, oh, I binged, it's a failure, because that's not true. The last tool slash tip I want to add here is to get really honest with yourself after a binge. If it feels like Groundhog's Day with binges, they're happening every night or every weekend or every social event, you keep finding yourself in the same position and you're not already getting support, consider starting to do some research online or reaching out for support, because sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, and we end up spinning our wheels in place and spinning in the same cycles without the support of an outside professional. This is the exact thing I work with clients on. I really love helping folks heal from binge eating, and I would absolutely love to help you heal from binge eating if it's something that you are wanting support on. You can head to the link below in the show notes and fill out an application to work together. And I will read it and then reach out to you, and we'll book a free discovery call so we can meet each other and see if we'd be a good fit to work together. And then we would go from there. If you want to learn more about the way I work with clients, you can visit my website at leokernrd.com, and you can learn more about my philosophy, my style, some client stories of folks who have gone through my programs, and you can feel it out for yourself if it would feel like a good match. So that is all for today's episode on what to do after a binge. If you're listening to this right now and you've literally just binged, know that you will not feel this way forever. Time is a magical thing. The feeling will pass in time. And I'm so proud of you for being here and doing this work and listening to this episode and working on engaging with supportive tools that will help you meet your goals long term instead of these tools that are more destructive in the short term. That is it for today's episode, and I look forward to connecting with you on our next episode.